All right, so you are a resident philosopher ready to tackle a concept that's deceptively simple but oh so philosophically thorny.
Sure.
Buckle up, because today's deep dive takes us into the heart of authority.
Okay.
We've got excerpts from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, some choice arguments,
Yeah.
and a mission to unpack why this word so casually tossed around is a philosophical minefield.
Yeah. What's fascinating about authority is that it demands a deep dive into morality.
Oh, okay.
Unlike plain old power, which is just the ability to force someone's hand, authority seeks to justify itself.
Okay.
It wants us to believe in its right to command.
Okay, so it's not just about brute force.
Right.
There's this added layer of legitimacy, or
Yeah.
at least the pretense of legitimacy, right?
Yeah.
But as a philosopher, I'm already skeptical.
Right.
Does anyone really have the right to tell me what to do?
You've hit upon the core dilemma.
Ah,
Our sources dive into this by outlining different flavors of authority,
okay.
each with its own attempt to answer that very question.
Let's unpack these flavors then. First up, we've got justified coercion.
Right.
The example they give is an occupying force after a just war.
Yes.
Interesting, but how does that make them an authority and not just conquerors with bigger guns?
That's where the justified part comes in.
Okay.
Imagine a scenario where the occupying force is actively preventing further violence, restoring basic services, maybe even setting up a fair legal system.
Okay.
They're using force, yes, but arguably for the greater good.
So even if no one's thrilled about being occupied,
Right.
there's a sense that their actions, while coercive, are aimed at creating a more stable and just situation.
Yes.
Still feels a bit shaky on the moral obligation to obey front, though.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that's why justified coercion occupies a lower rung on the ladder of legitimacy.
Got it.
The source material then moves on to duty-based authority,
Okay.
where the moral waters get even murkier.
Okay, duty-based. This one feels trickier.
Yeah.
It's not just about avoiding punishment. There's a sense of obligation involved, but to what extent? The example they give of potentially overreaching government agency feels a bit weak, don't you think?
I agree.
Yeah.
A better illustration might be something closer to home.
Right?
Imagine you witness a friend commit a crime, maybe something minor.
Uh-huh.
Do you have a duty to report them, even knowing it could damage your friendship and potentially upend their life?
Ooh, now that's a real moral quandary.
Yeah.
On one hand, loyalty to your friend.
Right.
On the other, a potential duty to uphold justice, even if it's painful.
Yeah.
That gets to the heart of duty-based authority, doesn't it?
Yeah.
It's not blind obedience, but a struggle to balance competing obligations.
Precisely.
Okay.
And it highlights how messy this concept of authority gets when applied to real-life situations. But then our sources present the gold standard, the right to rule type of authority.
Yes.
Yeah.
The ideal scenario where rulers have this inherent moral right to command,
Yes.
and we, the ruled, have a corresponding moral duty to obey.
Right.
Sounds lovely, but does that actually exist outside of, like, Plato's Republic?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
Are there any authorities, be it individuals or institutions, that possess such unquestionable moral legitimacy?
Yeah.
This is where things get really interesting for you as a philosopher.
Okay.
Because before we even evaluate specific authorities, we have to ask ourselves, can any authority truly be reconciled with individual autonomy and moral responsibility?
Right.
That's the crux of it, isn't it? And it's a question that has haunted philosophers for centuries. Can we truly claim to be free-thinking individuals if we simply accept the dictates of authority no matter how legitimate it may seem?
Right. And morality is about making choices based on reason, and conscience doesn't blind obedience to authority undermine the whole project.
That's the challenge laid down by thinkers like Robert Paul Wolff, a prominent philosophical anarchist.
Okay.
He argues that the very concept of authority is fundamentally at odds with individual autonomy. For Wolff, submitting to authority means surrendering our capacity for independent moral judgment,
Okay.
which is essentially giving up on what makes us human.
Wow. Okay, so if we follow Wolff's line of thinking, any form of authority is inherently problematic,
Yes.
even if it's well-intentioned or leads to seemingly good outcomes. Is that right?
That's the radical core of the anarchist argument.
Okay.
But of course, there are counter-arguments.
Sure.
And our sources delve into some of the most compelling ones.
Okay.
One approach that attempts to bridge this gap between authority and autonomy is called
What's the gist of that? Sounds like it might offer a more pragmatic take on authority.
Exactly. Instrumentalism shifts the focus from the inherent right to rule to the potential benefits of obeying authority.
Okay.
The basic idea is that authority can be legitimate if following its dictates actually helps us live a more morally good life than if we're constantly trying to figure everything out on our own.
So it's kind of like a moral cost-benefit analysis.
Yeah.
We weigh the potential downsides of submitting to authority against the potential upsides of a well-ordered society, even if we might disagree with every single rule or decision.
That's a good way to put it. Think about something like traffic laws.
Okay.
They might feel arbitrary sometimes. Why the speed limit? Why that many stop signs?
Yeah.
But without those regulations, driving would be chaotic and dangerous.
Right.
So even if I question a particular traffic law, I follow it because, on the whole, the system helps create a safer environment for everyone.
Okay, I see how instrumentalism makes sense in that context.
Yeah.
But what about more complex situations where the moral stakes are higher?
Right.
Like what if a government enacts policies that you believe are fundamentally unjust?
Right.
Does instrumentalism just become a way to rationalize following the rules, even when those rules are wrong?
That's a crucial question, and it highlights the limitations of instrumentalism.
Okay.
It relies on the assumption that the authority in question is both competent and benevolent, which is, as history has shown us time and again, a risky bet.
Right. Blind trust in authority, even if it's framed as for the greater good, can have disastrous consequences.
Yeah.
So if instrumentalism isn't a foolproof solution, what other philosophical avenues can we explore to grapple with this authority puzzle?
Well, another major player in this debate is consent theory, which takes a very different approach.
Okay.
The core idea here is that authority is only legitimate if it's based on the consent of those being governed.
Consent theory. The classic we the people argument, it seems intuitively appealing.
Yes.
After all, as autonomous individuals, we should have the right to choose who or what we submit to.
Exactly. Our sources point out that consent theory often goes hand in hand with the concept of natural rights.
Okay.
The idea is that we're all born with certain inherent freedoms, and no authority can legitimately infringe upon those freedoms without our explicit agreement.
Okay, that makes sense. But even if we accept that we're all born with these natural rights,
Right.
doesn't the very act of living in a society require some degree of giving up those rights for the sake of the common good?
Yeah.
Like, I can't just claim my natural right to drive however I want if it endangers others on the road.
That's one of the classic counterarguments to consent theory. How do you balance individual freedom with the need for social order and collective action?
Right.
Can a society even function if everyone gets to pick and choose which rules they want to follow based on their own personal interpretation of their natural rights?
Good point. And this leads us, I suspect, to the very thorny issue of tacit consent, right?
Exactly.
The idea that simply by living in a place and benefiting from its systems, we're implicitly consenting to its authority, even if we never formally agreed to anything.
Tacit consent is a slippery concept, and even some of history's greatest minds, like David Hume, weren't buying it.
Yeah.
Is it really meaningful consent if there's no real choice involved?
Right.
What if the cost of opting out, say, leaving your country, is too high? Does simply existing in a place truly equate to a genuine endorsement of its authority?
It feels like we're pushing the boundaries of what consent really means. And as a philosopher, I'm always wary of slippery slopes.
Right.
If we stretch the definition of consent too far, doesn't it lose its moral force?
That's the danger. And it's why some philosophers like John Rawls argue that we need to move beyond a purely individualistic framework of consent and think more about the principles that would lead to a just and fair society for everyone, regardless of their specific consent or agreement.
Okay, so if individual consent is problematic,
Right.
what does Rawls propose as an alternative?
Well, Rawls introduces the idea of a reasonable consensus,
Okay.
suggesting that legitimacy stems not from each individual's explicit agreement, but from principles that rational, impartial people would agree upon if they were designing a society from scratch.
Interesting. So it's not about getting everyone to sign on the dotted line, but rather creating a system based on principles that most reasonable people would find fair and justifiable,
Yes.
even if they have different personal preferences or beliefs.
Exactly. It shifts the focus from individual whims to shared principles of justice and fairness, but of course it's not without its challenges.
I can imagine defining reasonable in a way that satisfies everyone is probably impossible.
Right.
One person's reasonable is another person's outrageous right.
You've hit on a major point of contention: who gets to decide what's reasonable? And what happens when deeply held beliefs clash with what others consider to be rational or impartial? These are the kinds of questions that keep political philosophers up at night.
And for good reason, it seems like any attempt to find a universal standard of reasonableness is bound to run into trouble in a world with such diverse values and perspectives.
Yes.
So if Rawls' approach isn't a silver bullet, what other avenues are there for thinking about the justification of authority?
Well, some philosophers like Ronald Dworkin take a radically different approach,
All right.
suggesting that perhaps we've been framing the whole question of political authority too narrowly.
Oh, in what way?
Well, Dworkin argues that we often think of political authority in terms of contracts or agreements,
Uh-huh.
as if we're individuals entering into a transaction with the state.
Okay.
But what if it's more like family or deep friendship?
Intriguing. So instead of viewing the state as some external entity we've consented to be governed by, we
Right.
should see it as something we're inherently a part of,
Yes.
like a community with shared values and obligations.
Exactly. We have responsibilities to our families and friends, even if we didn't formally agree to them. We care about their well-being and contribute to the relationship because it's meaningful, not just out of obligation. Dworkin suggests that a similar logic can apply to political communities. We have obligations to our fellow citizens and to the institutions that bind us together,
Hmm.
not because we sign a contract, but because we're part of something larger than ourselves.
That's a powerful idea. But it also raises some questions. Can a political community really evoke the same sense of loyalty and obligation as family or close friends?
Right.
I mean, I care about my country, but it's not exactly the same as my relationship with my parents.
Yeah.
And what happens when the political community is deeply divided or when its actions seem to contradict your own values? Does that shared sense of obligation still hold?
Those are excellent questions, and they get to the heart of the challenges and complexities of Dworkin's view. It's a provocative idea that invites us to rethink our relationship with authority, but it also demands careful consideration of its potential pitfalls. After all, political communities can be just as flawed and messy as any family.
That's for sure. But before we get too deep into the family dynamics of the state, I think we need to address the elephant in the room, democracy.
Okay.
Isn't that supposed to be the ultimate answer to the authority puzzle?
Right?
The idea that we all have a voice and a vote. So even if we disagree with a particular outcome, we've at least had a say in the process.
Yes, democracy. It's often touted as the most legitimate form of government because it aims to distribute power more evenly and give everyone a chance to participate in decision-making. But even democracy is not immune to the complexities of authority.
I can imagine, even if the process is fair, the outcome might still be something I strongly disagree with. Does that mean I'm obligated to follow a law or policy just because the majority voted for it? Where do we draw the line between respecting the democratic process and standing up for our own moral convictions?
You've hit upon a core tension within democratic theory. How do you balance the will of the majority with the protection of individual rights and the pursuit of justice? What happens when these values come into conflict? These are the kinds of dilemmas that philosophers have been grappling with for centuries.
It seems like every time we think we've got a handle on this authority thing, another layer of complexity emerges.
Yeah.
But I have to admit, I'm finding this deep dive incredibly stimulating.
Good.
It's making me question assumptions I never even realized I had about power legitimacy and my own role as a citizen.
That's the beauty of philosophy, isn't it? It challenges us to examine the foundations of our beliefs and to grapple with the messy realities of human existence.
It sure does. But before we get too carried away with existential pondering, maybe we should start bringing this deep dive in for a landing.
Okay.
After all, we promised our listeners a shortcut to being well-informed, not a full-blown philosophy degree.
Agreed. Let's see if we can distill some key takeaways and leave our philosopher friend with some thought-provoking questions to ponder on their own.
All right, so after this whirlwind tour through the philosophical landscape of authority, where do we even begin to make sense of it all? What are the key takeaways for our philosopher in residence, and maybe even for all of us grappling with these questions in our own lives?
Well, I think the first takeaway is that authority is far more complex than it might initially appear.
Yeah.
It's not just about brute force or giving orders. There are layers upon layers of moral and philosophical justification,
Okay.
and they often come into conflict with each other.
Right. We've got this tension between individual freedom and autonomy on one hand, and the need for social order and collective action on the other.
Yeah.
And there's no easy formula for striking the perfect balance.
Exactly what's considered legitimate authority can vary wildly depending on the context, the culture, and the specific values at stake.
Okay.
And what might seem perfectly reasonable to one person can feel deeply oppressive to another.
You know, this deep dive has really made me realize how often I've taken authority for granted.
Yeah.
I haven't always stopped to question why I should obey a particular rule or follow a certain leader.
Right.
I think I've often just defaulted to a kind of uncritical acceptance,
Yeah.
especially when it comes to institutions or figures I generally respect.
That's a common human tendency. We're social creatures, and we're often conditioned from a young age to respect authority figures. But philosophy invites us to step back and examine those ingrained assumptions,
Right.
to ask ourselves, why should I obey? And to demand a compelling answer.
It's like we're being asked to reevaluate our relationship with authority, to really understand the underlying principles and consider the potential consequences of both obedience and disobedience,
Yeah.
and to recognize that those choices have ripple effects.
Yeah. Precisely when we choose to obey or disobey, we're not just acting as individuals, we're shaping the social fabric around us.
Okay.
We're either reinforcing existing power structures or contributing to their transformation.
That's a powerful realization. It's like we're all part of this ongoing conversation about power legitimacy and the kind of world we want to create.
Absolutely. And that conversation is happening at every level, from our personal relationships to global politics.
Right.
Think about the dynamics within your own family, your workplace, your community. How do you navigate authority in those spaces? When do you choose to comply? When do you push back? And how do those choices shape the dynamics of the relationships?
Wow. My mind is spinning. It's like you give me this whole new lens through which to view the world.
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to need a notebook just to keep track of all the questions this deep dive has raised.
That's the mark of a good philosophical exploration. It leaves you with more questions than answers and a burning desire to keep digging deeper.
Speaking of digging deeper before we wrap up, there's one question that's been nagging at me. We've talked about all these different sources of authority, consent, reason, tradition, democracy, but what about expertise? In a world that's increasingly complex and specialized, does expertise itself become a new form of authority?
That's a fantastic question, and one that's becoming more and more relevant in everything from science and technology to economics and public health. Do we have a moral obligation to defer to experts even when we don't fully understand their reasoning or agree with their conclusions? How do we balance the need for expert guidance with the importance of critical thinking and individual judgment? These are questions that I hope you, our philosopher friend, will continue to grapple with.
I definitely will. This deep dive has been a real eye-opener, and I'm feeling both inspired and a little overwhelmed by the sheer scope of these questions.
That's the beauty and the burden of philosophical inquiry. It expands our horizons, challenges our assumptions, and reminds us that the quest for understanding is a lifelong journey.
Well, you've been a fantastic guide on this journey, and I'm incredibly grateful for your insights.
It's been my pleasure. And to all our listeners out there, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep diving deep into the world of ideas. Who knows what fascinating discoveries await?